Hello everyone, this is Aaron Fitz from ATF Gaming and welcome back to the ATF Weekly NASCAR Review for the Daytona 500 weekend. Today we will cover both dual races, Truck Series race, Xfinity race, and of course the Daytona 500. So this is most likely going to be the longest ATF Weekly Review that we're going to have this season because we have 5 races that we need to cover, essentially. I have 4 pages worth of notes for this episode. And that's still probably not going to cover all of it, and I'm probably not going to remember things. So I apologize if I forget things that happened on Thursday, because this was 4 straight days of racing, 5 races, like I said, and I was sick all weekend. So I have not been feeling well, hence the lack of videos. So if I forget things, I apologize. I haven't been totally in it this weekend. But let's start with the Gatorade duels. It's not called those anymore. It's so hard when there's a sponsorship like the Bud Shootout, Gatorade Duels. That happened for so long. I grew up with that, and then they changed the sponsorship. But the duels, which is the Can-Am duels now, Duel 1 was all the inside row people. So Bowman, who got the pole in qualifying, started on pole in duel number 1, and he had a good strategy, in my opinion. The only way that Bowman was going to be knocked off of the pole is if he wrecked and had to go to a backup car. So why in the world would he try to race this race when you have a locked-in pole? You still have 2 or 3 practice sessions to get drafting practice. So he was smart. He went to the back immediately. Didn't really help the teammates out. Jimmy Johnson was right there. I think he was hoping for some more help from Bowman at the start. But he was smart. He went straight to the back. And then everybody kind of got single file, slowly but surely. And then one of the weirdest things that I think I've ever seen, coming into Tri-Oval, Jimmy Johnson, he got out of line. It was almost completely single file on the outside. He got out of line, so he obviously must have realized there was a problem. But then, I don't know if the tire blew or if he had a mechanical issue or what, but he got out of line and then shot back to the right. And wrecked Eric Almirola, and Daniel Suarez was also involved in that. So that took out Johnson and Almirola. Both of those would have to go to backup cars and start in the rear of the field for the 500. The big story in duel number 1 was Ricky Stenhouse Jr. He was being super aggressive with moves. It was mostly single file for the majority of the race, so he kept trying to, dive down on the inside, going into turns 1 and 3. Maybe some people will go with him. Maybe he can slide in and gain a spot. But a couple times it cost other people, because the way that this aero package is, if you get so close when you're trying to dive left, if you get so close to another car, you don't have to touch it, but that car in front will just spin like a top. And that happened twice. Once for William Byron and once for David Gilliland. And I really felt for David Gilliland because he was doing well, relatively. And that's a low-funded team. This is a team that's most, as far as I can recall, this is their first NASCAR race. Not NASCAR, Cup Series race. They're a prominent Truck Series team, but so they have to go to a backup car. They probably don't have very many cars, so I felt for them. Then the only other thing that really happened was Brad Keselowski wrecked off of Jamie McMurray. Don't remember the exact details about that because, like I said, that happened 4 days ago. There's been five races going on. But in the end, Ryan Blaney wins, which means he's going to qualify 3rd for Daytona 500. And really the majority of the race was dominated by Team Penske, Blaney, Logano, and Keselowski. And in the end, it was Johnson, Almirola, Keselowski, and Gilliland. They had to go to backup cars, so they ended up starting in the rear of the field for the Daytona 500. Now, moving on to duel number 2, far less eventful as far as stuff to talk about, but still fairly eventful. I would say duel 2 was probably more racy compared to duel 1. Duel 1, they raced each other for a little while, but then they got single file real quickly. Duel number 2, they were a lot more double file trying to make passes, but the Joe Gibbs cars worked together early. I believe 3 of the 4 of them were in this race, plus maybe Truex, I'm not sure. So they worked together and they led for the majority of the race. And then Eric Jones wrecked off of Chase Elliott in a very similar fashion to how Stenhouse wrecked William Byron and David Gilliland in the first duel. Elliott tried to make a move, dive low, and it just sucked Eric Jones' car around. And that also involved Matt DiBenedetto and Kyle Larson, in which those guys had to go to a backup car for DiBenedetto and Larson. And in the end, it paid off because Chase Elliott won the race and he'll start fourth for the Daytona 500. So that's my short description of the Gatorade duels. I don't really remember much from them because it was 4 days ago. So moving on, Truck Series. I was super excited watching qualifying, as if you guys watch my NASCAR Heat 2 series, you guys know that I raced the 46 Todd Gilliland Happy Dog car, the pedigree car with the Happy Dog on the back. And David Gilliland was running with that paint scheme. He's filling in for Todd Gilliland on the tracks that he's not old enough to drive yet. But he got on the pole, so the Happy Dog was technically in victory lane, I guess. Another win for the Happy Dog in spirit, I guess. Wasn't a win, but it was a pole. But then Gilliland won the opening stage as well. Fairly uneventful, only one caution for Travis Quattrell blowing an engine. Stage 2, extremely uneventful. Johnny Sauter winning stage 2. And then in the final stage, I guess it was kind of the big wreck. It was the start of one. Grant Enfinger got loose leading the bottom lane. It was double file. Enfinger was leading the bottom lane. He got loose. He hit the apron, shot back up the track, and I don't think he made contact with any other cars, but cars in the back started spinning, trying to avoid slowing down at different rates of speed. And ultimately, the person who got the biggest damage was Jennifer Jo Cobb. I'm sure David Land was saying, "Oh no, Jennifer Jo," but she was in the infield care center for a while. They did not announce her release until fairly close to the end of the race. So, but it was reported she took a hard hit, but just some minor bruising, and she'll be back next week at Atlanta. All right, moving on to page 2 of my notes. John Hunter Nemechek, he made contact with somebody. I can't quite remember who it was. But he got a tire rub. It was extremely obvious he was going to blow a tire, but he did not move over until it was happening. And he blew a tire in front of the entire field. Collects Brett Moffitt, Stuart Friesen, and Mike Snyder. So I think Nemechek could have handled that a little better. This is John Hunter Nemechek. Could have handled that a lot better. But, oh well, that's the youth of the Truck Series, honestly. I am looking forward to seeing what he can do in the Xfinity Series with Chip Ganassi, but that's still probably not a smart decision. One real underdog story in the early portion of the race was Clay Greenfield. He qualified third, I think, and he was up front for the majority of the first stage. When they pitted at the end of the stage, he fell back. Because low-funded team, probably not the best pit crew. But then, towards the end of the race, he got wrecked by Matt Crafton and also collected Brian Dowsett. Well, okay, I need to pronounce this. Dowser? I don't know. They pronounce it in some fancy way. When I look at how it's written, it's Dawsat. But that's not how they pronounce it. There's a silent T or something. I don't know. Moving on, going back to David Gilliland, he ran up front for the majority of the race, won stage 1, like I said, but he was drafting with Spencer Davis, who is a teammate at Kyle Busch Motorsports, but he's a relatively new guy. This was his first Truck Series race. I'd never heard his name in my lifetime, so I don't know where Kyle Busch found him, maybe ARCA or K&M, but he was a pretty bad bump drafter. And he gave David Gilliland a shot. And David Gilliland is one of the better restrictor plate racers in all 3 series. He gave Gilliland a shot, and he could not handle it. And Gilliland hit the wall and was pretty much out of the race from there. And that was pretty much all of the incidents, Johnny Sauter ends up winning the race over Justin Haley, Joe Nemechek, Ben Rhodes, and Scott Lagasse Jr. Lagasse had a shot at the end, but he said in his post-race interview that he just did not make the right move. So, unfortunately, he did not win the race, but he did get a 5th place. Good effort for Joe Nemechek. I'm hopeful. I hope that Joe runs the full season this year and doesn't start in park, because last year he had John Hunter running the full season and Joe just started in parked in the 87. But now that John Hunter is only running a partial schedule, I hope Joe runs for the championship. That'd be nice to have another older figure. I mean, we call Crafton and Sauter the older figures, but when you look at Joe, he's 56 years old. So that would be really cool to see Joe do that. And notable shout out to Jordan Anderson. He's running a self-funded car, basically, self-race team. So he finished 9th, so that's an excellent effort for him. And that is the truck race. Overall, a decent race. Not the best truck series race I've ever seen, just because I've seen a lot of really good truck races, honestly. But moving on, so that's Friday. Saturday, we got the Xfinity series. And it started off with a bang even before qualifying, because there were some inspection issues. Now, I don't know if the Xfinity series is also using the new OSS optical scanning system that the Cup Series is using, the Hawkeye system. I don't know if they're using that in the Xfinity Series as well. But if not, then they use the old inspection system. And the crew chiefs for Austin Dillon and Mike Harmon got ejected from the racetrack, as well as Dillon's car chief, for inspection issues. I don't quite remember exactly what the issues were, but I've never heard of anybody ever getting ejected from the racetrack. So I don't know if that's a new rule, or if it's just there was something so severe that they had to take action or what. But they got ejected before qualifying even began. And then after qualifying, there was a controversy because Matt Tifft and Josh Williams both failed post-qualifying inspection, which means their times were disallowed. But they both made the race on the owner's points provisions that the Xfinity Series has, which caused Timmy Hill, who got in on owner's points originally, to miss the race, and Gray Galding to make the race. So I feel for Timmy Hill, small team, and I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Do I think Tifft and Williams should have been disqualified from any provisional? I don't know, but I still feel for Timmy Hill because he small team. He comes to the track every week. Doesn't matter what car he's racing, and he fights hard. So felt bad for him. But Daniel Hemrick was on the pole. Joey Logano qualified 3rd, I think. But he had to make an unapproved adjustment before the race, so he went to the back of the field. So now on to the race. The first 10 laps were extremely chaotic because of one person and one person alone. And this is a person who I've had many issues with throughout my time on YouTube and just in life in general. Austin Cindric. I've been very clear, and if you follow me on Twitter, I was kind of sort of live tweeting the race. Austin Cindric was an absolute train wreck. He could not control his car, and I'm surprised he made it 10 laps without wrecking, but he did finally lose control and collect Christopher Bell, both Rookie of the Year and Championship contenders, out on lap 10. But besides that, fairly uneventful through both Stage 1 and Stage 2, honestly. Kyle Larson won Stage 1, and Chase Elliott wins Stage 2. I should be more specific in my notes, because there was Chase Elliott and then there was Elliott Sadler. I just wrote Elliott. So I believe it was Chase Elliott who won Stage 2. Larson won Stage 1. those were the only cautions within those times. The next big thing that happened was Elliott Sadler and Chase Elliott, Elliottception there, they got penalized for locking bumpers, which has very clearly been prohibited in the Xfinity series. They talked about it on the broadcast that they made some adjustments to the aero package, so it was almost impossible for them to bump. But they managed to do it, and they got penalized. They were leading the race, so it was extremely obvious for Steve O'Donnell and the crew to figure that out. But that just sparked the whole controversy, and every rule that NASCAR has a controversy of why it was Elliott Sadler pushing Chase Elliott, I believe. Why would the guy being pushed be penalized? And at least the explanation I got, and I somewhat agree, is for people like Chase Elliott, Kyle Larson, Joey Logano, or similar situations where guys not running for points, they could just shove their teammates the whole race. They can get penalized, but the teammate, they just shove them up front. And it doesn't matter because the teammate would be running for points. The guy getting pushed would not be. You only penalize the guy in the back. The teammate in front gets off scot-free. So I understand the rule. I do think it needs to be tweaked. But that's for the Xfinity Series guys to figure out, not me. Next big thing. So that was the first big penalty thing that happened. The second big penalty thing happened after Ryan Reed forced Ryan Truex below the yellow line in the corner, which is extremely dangerous because there's such a banking change going from the high banked corners to the flat apron. Ryan Reed forced Truex down, and Truex saved it, but there was a wreck behind him, so a caution came out, and they penalized Ryan Reed for forcing Truex below the yellow line, which is something I've never seen enforced. That's apparently been a rule, but I have never seen that be enforced, ever. So that just brings back the whole thing of, why... It just goes back to the clash where Stenhouse got penalized for being passing below the yellow line when Kyle Busch forced him, and it's such a hard rule to police. I think NASCAR needs to redefine that rule. I said that in last week's video, and I'll just kind of leave it there. But like I said, Truex got forced below the yellow line, and behind them they wrecked. Cole Custer and Daniel Hemrick got involved, and Ryan Reed got a penalty from that. I believe it was a one-lap penalty. All right, now we're on to page 3 of my notes. So that leads up towards the end of the race. Elliott Sadler has a single car spin, which leads to overtime. Now let's go back to last week and review what happened in the ARCA Series race, because we were complaining about it took the ARCA Series like an hour to finish one lap because of they have to end on the green rule. But now we have the overtime rule, and this has not been manipulated like this in real life. Now, if you watch my NASCAR Heat 2 videos, I manipulate this all the time. But there were 5 overtimes, and it took a long time to finish this race. So, in the first overtime, there was a wreck in front. Almirola made the move high, and Larson tried to block, but he spun Almirola. They wrecked. Many front runners involved. That was the big one. Larson, Dillon, Almirola, Logano, all guys who were fighting very hard up front. They were wrecked. And then, as a result of that caution, Daniel Suarez, who was the leader after all that went through, ran out of fuel. So poor Larry Mack in the booth had to try to explain all this fuel mileage stuff, and I just felt bad for him. So now we move on to overtime number 2. Spencer Gallagher had a relatively harmless spin. A single car didn't involve anybody else, but he did hit the inside wall, so NASCAR had to throw the caution. So moving on to overtime number 3, which was the most eventful as far as what caused the next overtime, because there was a wreck coming out of turn 4 coming to the white flag. Now, if you guys remember, last year we had the stupid overtime rule where there was a line like randomly placed in the backstretch, and if you pass the overtime line, the next flag ends the race, blah, blah, blah. But now they brought the old rule back where the white flag is the overtime line. They still call it the overtime line, which I'm not a huge fan of. But, so the wreck happened coming out of turn 4. NASCAR, praise the Lord, actually called a caution before they hit the start-finish line. They have had a habit of, in previous instances, waiting like an extra 4 or 5 seconds for the leader to cross the overtime line, start, finish line, whatever, before they throw the caution. So I am very appreciative that they actually did it right this time. But that was the third overtime. Fourth overtime, Dylan Lumpton had a single car spin, lots of debris, so that was the fourth overtime caution. Now for the fifth overtime, which is the last overtime, it was a close race. Going down the backstretch, it was Elliott Sadler, Tyler Reddick, two teammates for Junior Motorsports, Ryan Truex, and, oh my god, I can't remember, and Ryan Reed. Ryan Truex and Ryan Reed, I believe. They were going down the backstretch. All four of them were locked bumpers, but since Sadler and Reddick was on the inside, I saw them a lot more clearly. So I thought NASCAR was going to penalize Sadler and Reddick for bumping, but they didn't. And it ended up being those two who fought for the win. And it was, and I'm not exaggerating, nobody who has written about this is exaggerating. It is the closest finish in NASCAR history. NASCAR, when they track the cars, they go to 3 decimal points, so tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. When you go back to thousandths on this finish, they were tied when you look at those numbers. So they had to go to a photo review. And it was 3 inches. 3 inches. And then today, during pre-race coverage for Daytona 500, they revealed it was .0004. So 4 ten-thousandths of a second is what the result was. And Tyler Reddick beats Elliott Sadler for his second career win, locking him into the playoffs. So good for him. Final results as far as top 5 goes was Tyler Reddick, Elliott Sadler, Ryan Reed, Kaz Gralla, and Garrett Smithley. Those last two really making progress. I think Ryan Truex ended up finishing 7th. He had a rough final corners. But overall, it was a very exciting Xfinity race. I haven't touched on it much, but the Cup regulars were so aggressive leading this race. I cannot believe they did not have a big wreck before overtime. But they were so aggressive. It was such good racing, and I am honestly going to call it as the most exciting Xfinity race I have ever watched. I'm going to call that, my opinion, most exciting Xfinity race I've ever watched. So, that's the Xfinity race. We're 4/5 of the way there. Now for the Daytona 500, the big race today. Today, as I'm recording this will be yesterday when the video goes up. So starting, we had Corey LaJoie. I love him dearly, not really, but I swear every single caution that's ever caused by a backmarker has to be Corey LaJoie. He blew an engine, and it had to be Corey LaJoie that would cause the first caution of the year. I'm pretty sure it was Corey LaJoie who caused the first caution last year. That's Daytona 500. Because I remember it became a running joke in my household that Corey LaJoie was always the one causing cautions for like the first 5 races of the year. But he blew an engine, so that is TriStar Motorsports 72. They were out of the race early. Then there were pit stops. This was during stage 1. It was about halfway, so a good time for pit stops. Denny Hamlin had issues getting on pit road. He overstood his box. he moved back. He backed up into the box, but his front was still on the line. So he's technically out of the box still. And the fuel man started fueling while he was on the line before they backed up even further. So that is now a 1-lap penalty for Hamlin. And then after that, once we got back green, Kyle Busch had, I think, 2 separate issues with flat tires. The first one, relatively harmless, he came down pit road, but the second one, he just couldn't handle it and wrecked and caught Jamie McMurray and DJ Kennington in the wreck. So, unfortunate for them. And I don't know if Kyle Busch had an issue with a rub. Maybe he made contact with somebody else. I don't know. End of stage 1 was extremely aggressive. Me and the family, we were watching this, and we could not believe how aggressive they were being. And neither could the announcers, and we knew something bad was going to happen. And it did. There was just slicing and dicing. The front of the field got backed up. Everybody had to check up, and somewhere down the line there was just too much checking up, and they started wrecking. Jimmy Johnson, Daniel Suarez, William Byron, Eric Jones, all involved in that. Kurt Busch ends up winning the stage by avoiding all of the mayhem. Moving on to the final page of my notes here, finally. So then in stage 2, about halfway again, there was a wreck involving Chase Elliott, Kevin Harvick, and, unfortunately, Danica Patrick. I was hoping Danica would end up having a good finish, but we all knew this was going to end in a wreck, and it did, and oh well. But that's a fitting way for Danica Patrick to end her NASCAR career, if it is indeed over. But that wreck took out a couple front runners in Elliott and Harvick, and Ryan Blaney ends up winning the second stage. He had led the majority of the race in general. The beginning of stage 3, and really the majority of the final stage, was single file. They had finally seen, the wreck at the end of stage 1 and the wreck involving Chase Elliott and Kevin Harvick, and Danica Patrick, that they finally realized that they need to just calm down, and they ran single file for a while. They had their first set of green flag pit stops, mostly decent pit stops. Some front runners fell a lap down because of coming in without much help. But the only real penalty was Joey Logano. I don't know if he lost his brakes or what. He was coming in second. It was Ryan Blaney and Joey Logano leading the race. And I don't know if Logano just wanted to beat Blaney on the pit road for whatever reason, but Logano was super fast coming on the pit road, and he was caught speeding in the first sector. So he had to do a pit stop and fell a lap down. And then again, they went back to single file racing. There was a little bit of slicing and dicing when Logano came off a pit road. He'd just fallen a lap down, but he was trying to make his way into the single file pack, and there was a little wiggling, but in the end it sorted itself out until William Byron. He had a single car crash. Byron had been damaged in the earlier accident, so I assume it was a flat tire from a tire rub or whatever, but that was about 10 laps to go. So, those of you who know me, I always root for the underdog, and honestly, I wish more people rooted for the underdog. For the entire last segment, for the most part, my favorite driver, Matt DiBenedetto, was in the top 5, top 10. And he was there. He was in it to win it. Also in front with Brendan Gaughan, who now is part-time in the Xfinity Series, and he'll be running the 4 restrictor plate races as well. They were in the top 10 when this caution came out, and they were fighting hard when the restart happened. DiBenedetto was in 6th, I believe. Gaughan ended up being right behind him. But ultimately, the single fileness could not stay, and on the restart they had some issues with Ryan Blaney and Kurt Busch, and they ended up taking out the majority of the front runners. Stenhouse was involved, Alex Bowman was involved, and of course Matt DiBenedetto and Brendan Gaughan were involved, taking away all of my hopes and dreams of having a Cinderella story finish to this race. But that took the majority of the front runners out, led to overtime. Luckily, we only had to do one overtime this time. Eric Almirola came out of the restart with the lead, but they were being very aggressive behind, and the duo of Austin Dillon and Darrell Wallace Jr. got hooked together, and they made a huge run on Almirola. And it was probably a dirty pass. Dillon gave Almirola a huge shove, and Almirola got loose, and then Dillon ended up spinning him. This was after the white flag, so NASCAR let them race to the line. It was a single-car crash. And Austin Dillon, 3-car, 20 years after Dale Earnhardt won his Daytona 500, Austin Dillon wins the Daytona 500, locks himself into the chase. The guy whose grandfather basically paved his way through everything. He even admitted as much in his celebratory speech. And it was, out of all things that could have happened, that was probably the ending I didn't want. When you look at the top 10, I'll read the top 10 off. It was Dillon. Darrell Wallace Jr. ended up finishing third. Darrell Wallace Jr. ended up finishing second, my mistake. Denny Hamlin third. Joey Logano fourth after going a lap down on like 3 separate occasions. Chris Buescher ended up finishing fifth. Paul Menard sixth. Ryan Blaney seventh. Ryan Newman eighth. Michael McDowell ninth. AJ Allmendinger 10th. Out of those 10 people, the person I wanted to win the least was Austin Dillon and probably Joey Logano, but especially Austin Dillon. So, in my personal view, I wasn't thrilled with the ending, but it was overall a good race and overall a really good weekend. Now we just got to tamper our expectations and get ready for the long haul in the season of boringness, of mile and a halves and more mile and a halves and more mile and a halves and a couple short tracks and then more mile and a halves and more boring racing. So next week I believe it's a triple header, Trucks Xfinity and Cup at Atlanta, so I'm looking forward to that. And if you have any thoughts, comments on this week's video, on the races that happened this weekend, be sure to leave them in the comments below. I'll happily interact and answer some questions, stuff like that. But I will see you next time. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to see more content from ATF Gaming, be sure to hit that red subscribe button. It really means a lot to me, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.